Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today we're going to do an analysis of Snow White. It's always fun when Deb and I are on our own. Lisa is traveling today to pick up a fairy tale and kind of move it around, look at it, be curious about it from a Jungian perspective. And it can be really interesting and exciting, particularly a fairy tale that is so present in our modern culture. Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty. Some of these fairy tales, which are ancient, some people speculate are perhaps even thousands of years old before they were finally recorded, often by the Grimm's brothers for us, capture ancient and archetypal information. One of the things that's unique about fairy tales is that fairy tales have been curated by the collective for hundreds, if not thousands of years, meaning that if a story is too tied to a specific cultural narrative, over time it tends to fall away. If a story has ancient and eternal patterns in it, it stays alive regardless of time and culture. So we're turning to the original Grimm's version of the story, which is quite different from what we might be familiar with in the Disney cartoons, or what turned out to be the rather disappointing recent Disney reimagining of the story. So here we are with Snow White, and underneath the fantasy of poison apples and magic mirrors are many themes that are relevant to us. You know, the brutal pressures of comparison, the terror of aging, the obsession with youth, the fraught process of growing into adulthood and becoming oneself, and the loss of innocence when we meet betrayal. We all have evil stepmothers, so to speak, voices inside of us that give us ill advice. So there is a universality to all of these tales, and Snow White, which seems to be very alive in the collective, is one that we're going to work with today. So we're going to begin by reading the original tale, and then we're all going to roll up our sleeves. The original tale, there'll be a link in the show notes if you would like to have access to the original tale while we're working with it on the episode.
And if you want to just sit back, relax, and let yourself be read to, that will be really great too.
On Saturday, May 17th, join me and Deb for a Shadow and Dreams seminar, a sneak preview of how we work with shadow and dreams in this Jungian Life Dream School. Every night, our dreams confront us with shadow, what the waking mind doesn't want to know. Our dreams bring shadow close in order to compensate, complement, or contradict the conscious attitude. During the 1-hour session, we'll dive deeper into Carl Jung's concept of the shadow and see how it fits in with dream work. We'll also conduct a live dream interpretation using a dream submitted by an attendee. There'll be time to ask your questions about Jungian dream analysis, and we'll reveal a special TJL Dream School offering for spring 2025, exclusive to seminar attendees. There will be a recording available if you book a space and then can't make it. So, if you're curious about shadow and dreams or would like to know more about our dream school, we hope to see you at 12 p.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, May 17th. Follow the link in the show notes to book your free space.
And so the Grimm's brothers titled this Little Snow White. Once upon a time in the middle of winter, when snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, a beautiful queen was sitting and sewing at a window with a black ebony frame. And as she was sewing and looking out the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell on the snow. The red looked so beautiful on the white snow that she thought to herself, "If only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and black as the wood of the window frame." Soon thereafter she gave birth to a little daughter who was as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. That's why the child was called Little Snow White. The queen was the most beautiful woman in the entire land and was very proud about her beauty. She also had a mirror, and every morning she stepped in front of it and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And the mirror would answer, "You, my queen, are fairest of all." And then she knew for certain that there was nobody more beautiful in the entire world. However, little Snow White grew up, and when she was 7 years old, she was so beautiful that her beauty surpassed even that of the queen. And when the queen asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" the mirror answered, "You, my queen, may have a beauty quite rare, but little Snow White is 1,000 times more fair." Well, when the queen heard the mirror speak this way, she became pale with envy, and from that hour onward she hated Snow White. And when she looked at her and thought that little Snow White was to blame, that she, the queen, was no longer the most beautiful woman in the world, her heart turned against little Snow White. Her jealousy kept upsetting her, and so she summoned the huntsman and said, "Take the child out into the forest to a spot far from here, then stab her to death, and bring me back her lungs and liver as proof of your deed. And after that I'll cook them with salt and eat them." The huntsman took little Snow White and led her out into the forest. But when he drew his hunting knife and was about to stab her, she began to weep and pleaded so much to let her live, and promised never to return, but to run deeper into the forest. The huntsman was moved to pity, also because she was so beautiful. Anyway, he thought the wild beasts in the forest would soon devour her. "I'm glad I won't have to kill her." Just then, a young boar came dashing by, and the huntsman stabbed it to death. He took out the lungs and liver and brought it to the queen as proof that the child was dead. Then she boiled them in salt, ate them, and thought she had eaten little Snow White's lungs and liver. Meanwhile, little Snow White was so all alone in the huge forest that she became afraid and began to run and run over sharp stones and through thorn bushes. She ran the entire day, and finally, as the sun was about to set, she came upon a little cottage that belonged to 7 dwarves. However, they were not home, but had gone to their mines. When little Snow White entered, she found everything tiny, but dainty and neat. There was a little table with a white tablecloth, and on it were 7 little plates and 7 tiny spoons, 7 tiny knives and tiny forks, and 7 tiny cups. In a row against the wall stood 7 little beds, recently covered with sheets. Since she was so hungry and thirsty, little Snow White ate some vegetables and bread from each of the little plates and had a drop of wine to drink out of each tiny cup. And since she was so tired, she wanted to lay down and sleep. So she began trying out the beds, but none of them suited her until she found that the 7th one was just right. So she lay down in it and fell asleep. When it turned night, the 7 dwarves returned home from their work and lit their 7 little candles. Then they saw that someone had been in their house, and the first dwarf said, "Who's been sitting in my chair? Who's eaten off my plate?" And the second, "Who's eaten some of my bread?" And the third, "Who's eaten some of my vegetables?" And the fourth, "Who's been using my fork?" And the fifth, "Who's been cutting with my little knife?" And the sixth, Who has something to drink from my little cup?" Then the dwarf looked around and said, "Who's been sleeping in my bed?" Then the second cried out, "Someone's been sleeping in my bed." And he was followed by each one of them until the seventh dwarf looked at his bed and saw little Snow White lying there asleep. The others came running over to him, and they were so astounded that they screamed and fetched their 7 little candles to observe little Snow White. "Oh, my lord! Oh, my lord!" they explained. "How beautiful she is!" They took great delight in her, but didn't wake her up. Instead, they let her sleep in the bed, while the 7th dwarf spent an hour in each one of his companions' bed until the night had passed. When little Snow White awoke, they asked her who she was and how she had managed to come to their cottage. Then she told them how her mother had wanted to have her killed, how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had run all day until she had eventually arrived at their cottage. Then the dwarves took pity on her and said, "If you keep house for us, cook, sew, and make the beds, wash and knit, and if you'll keep everything neat and orderly, you can stay with us, and we'll provide you with everything you need. When we come home in the evening, dinner must be ready. During the day, we're in the mines and dig for gold. You'll be alone and will have to watch out for the queen and not let anyone enter the cottage." In the meantime, the queen believed that she was once again the most beautiful woman in the land and stepped before her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest in the land of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, may have a quite rare beauty, but beyond the 7 mountains, I must tell little Snow White is living quite well. Indeed, she's still 1,000 times more fair." When the queen heard this, she was horrified, for she saw that she had been deceived and that the huntsman had not killed little Snow White. Since nobody but the 7 dwarves lived in the 7 mountains region, the queen knew immediately that little Snow White was dwelling with them, and began once again plotting ways to kill her. As long as the mirror refused to say that she was the most beautiful woman in the land, she would remain upset. Since she couldn't be absolutely certain and didn't trust anyone, she disguised herself as an old peddler woman, painted her face so that nobody could recognize her, and went to the cottage of the 7 dwarves, where she knocked at the door and cried out, "Open up! Open up! I'm the old peddler woman. I've got pretty wares for sale." Little Snow White looked out the window. "What do you have for sale?" "Stay laces, dear child," the old woman replied, and took out a lace woven from yellow, red, and blue silk. "Do you want it?" "Well, yes," said little Snow White, and thought, "I can certainly let this good old woman inside. She's honest enough." So little Snow White unbolted the door and bought the lace. "My goodness, you're so sloppily laced up," said the old woman. "Come, I'll lace you up properly for once." Little Snow White stood in front of the old woman, who took the lace and tied it around little Snow White so tightly that she lost her breath and fell down as if dead. Then the queen was satisfied and left. Not long after nightfall, the dwarves came home, and when they saw their dear Snow White lying on the ground, they were horrified, for she seemed to be dead. They lifted her up, and when they saw that she was laced too tightly, they cut the lace in 2, and at once she began to breathe a little, and after a while she had fully revived. "That was nobody else but the queen," they said. "She wanted to take your life. Be careful and don't let anyone else enter the cottage." Now the queen asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, may have a beauty quite rare, but little Snow White's alive. This I must tell. She's with the dwarves and doing quite well. Indeed, she's still 1,000 times more fair." The queen was so horrified that all her blood rushed to her heart, and when she realized that little Snow White was alive once again, so she began thinking day and night how she could put an end to little Snow White. Finally, she made a poisoned comb, disguised herself in a completely different shape, and went off to the dwarves' cottage once again. When she knocked on the door, however, little Snow White called out, "I'm not allowed to let anyone enter." The queen then took out the comb, and when little Snow White saw it shine, and that the woman was someone entirely different from the one who she had previously met, she opened the door and bought the comb. "Come," said the peddler woman, "I'll comb your hair." But no sooner did the old woman stick the comb in little Snow White's hair than the maiden fell down and was dead. "Now you'll remain lying there," the queen said, and her heart became lighter as she returned home. However, the dwarves came just in the nick of the time. When they saw what happened, they pulled the poisoned comb out of little Snow White's hair, and she opened her eyes and was alive again. She promised the dwarves that she would certainly not let anyone inside again. Now the queen stepped in front of her mirror once more and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, my queen, may have a beauty quite rare, but little Snow White's alive. This I must tell. She's with the dwarves and doing quite well. Indeed, she's still 1,000 times more fair." When the queen heard this once again, she trembled and shook with rage. "Little Snow White shall die," she exclaimed, "even if it costs me my own life." Then she went into a secret chamber where no one was allowed to enter. Once inside, she made a deadly poisonous apple. On the outside, it looked beautiful with red cheeks. Anyone who saw it would be enticed to take a bite. Thereafter, she disguised herself as a peasant woman, went to the dwarf's cottage, and knocked on the door. Little Snow White looked and said, "I'm not allowed to let anyone inside. The 7 dwarves have strictly forbidden me." "Well, if you don't want to let me in, I can't force you," answered the peasant woman. "I'll surely get rid of my apples in time. But let me give you one to test." "No," said little Snow White. "I'm not allowed to take anything. The dwarves won't let me." "You're probably afraid," said the old woman. "Look, I'll cut the apple in 2. You eat the beautiful red half." However, the apple had been made with such cunning that only the red part was poisoned. When little Snow White saw the peasant woman eating her half, and when her desire to taste the apple grew stronger, she finally let the peasant woman give her the other half through the window. As soon as she took a bite of the apple, she fell to the ground and was dead. The queen rejoiced and went home and asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the mirror answered, "You, my queen, are now the fairest of all. Now I can rest in peace," she said. Once again, "I am the most beautiful in the land, and Snow White will remain dead this time." When the dwarves came home from the mines that evening, they found little Snow White lying on the ground, and she was dead. They unlaced her and tried to find something poisonous in her hair, but nothing helped. They couldn't revive her. So they laid her on a bier, and all 7 of them sat down beside it and wept for 3 whole days. Then they intended to bury her, but she looked more alive than dead, and she still had such pretty red cheeks. So instead they made a glass coffin and placed her inside so that she could easily be seen. Then they wrote her name on the coffin in gold letters and added the family name. One of the dwarves remained at home every day to keep watch over her. So little Snow White lay in the coffin for a long, long time, but did not rot. She was still white as snow and red as blood, and if her eyes could have opened, they would have been black as ebony, for she lay there as if she was sleeping. Now it happened that a prince came to the dwarf's cottage one day and wanted to spend the night there. When he entered the room and saw little Snow White lying in the coffin, and the 7 little candles casting their light upon her, he couldn't get enough of her beauty. Then he read the golden inscription and saw that she was a princess. So he asked the dwarfs to sell him the coffin with the dead little Snow White inside, but they wouldn't accept all the gold in the world for it. Then he pleaded with them to give little Snow White to him as a gift, because he couldn't live without gazing upon her, and he would honor her and hold her in high regard as his most beloved in this world. Well, the dwarves took pity on him and gave him the coffin, and the prince had it carried to his castle. It was then placed in his room, where he himself sat the entire day and couldn't take his eyes off her. And when he had to leave the room and couldn't see little Snow White, he became sad. Indeed, he couldn't eat a thing unless he was standing near the coffin. However, the servants had to carry the coffin from place to place in the castle all the time and became angry about this. And one time a servant opened the coffin, lifted little Snow White into the air and said, "Why was me be plagued with so much work, all because of a dead maiden?" On saying this, he shoved little Snow White's back with his hand, and out popped the nasty piece of apple that had been stuck in little Snow White's throat, and she was once again alive. As soon as this happened, she went to the prince, and when he saw his dear little Snow White alive, he rejoiced so much that he didn't know what to do. Then they sat down at the dinner table and ate with delight. The wedding was planned for the very next day, and Snow White's godless mother was invited to attend. When she now stepped before the mirror, she said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the mirror replied, "You, my queen, may have a beauty quite rare, but little Snow White is 1,000 times more fair." When she heard this, she was horrified and became so afraid, so very afraid, that she didn't know what to do. However, her jealousy drove her so much that she wanted to be seen at the wedding. When she arrived, she saw that little Snow White was the bride. Iron slippers were then heated over a fire. The queen had to put them on and dance in them, and her feet were miserably burned. But she had to keep dancing in them until she danced herself to death. Now, that's quite a different story from the Disneyfication of it.
The Disneyfication. I like that. Yes. And, many tales that the Brothers Grimm wrote down, they altered the mother, the wicked mother in the fairy tale, to a wicked stepmother, because these were going to be tales for children or that included children. And they just thought it was all just too, pardon the pun, grim for children. So oftentimes it's the wicked stepmother, but in this story, it's Mommy Dearest who is wicked. And the other fairy tale about, the queen's awful demise of having to put on shoes that are heated is like the story of the red shoes, where the disobedient girl has to dance in shoes that are red hot until she drops down dead.
Yes.
So these fairy tales, unlike the Disneyfication process, are brutal and violent. The child is going to be killed. The mother keeps trying to kill her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a dangerous world.
And the punishment eventually for the would-be murderous is gruesome.
Yes, and cannibalism. Mom's going to eat your liver and your lungs.
Yes, let's not leave out the cannibalism part.
Absolutely. We're in Silence of the Lambs now.
Yeah. So I think this really points to the archetypal reality of the original fairy tales and the vividness of human shadow, of the things that could be foisted onto, in this case, Snow White, but we've also got Cinderella and Rapunzel, who never gets to leave the tower until she's a teenager, and her hair grows so long that she can lift up the prince. These punishments are really violent and cruel and kind of horrifying if we really take them in. Hansel and Gretel, the witch is going to eat Hansel. Gretel pushes her into the oven where she burns to death. I forget what happens to the mother in that tale, but some real retribution.
Right. That so many of our fairy tales have been whitewashed. Hans Christian Andersen takes some of these tales and whitewashes them so they're cuter and more sentimental. And of course, it's perfectly reasonable to do that. There's nothing wrong with being inspired by a fairy tale and then creating some other work of literature or art or a cartoon as Disney did. But the wisdom is encoded in the ancient, sometimes stark and disturbing truths. Parents are often afraid to read their kids Grimm's fairy tales, but what they don't realize is that children's imaginations function in a very similar way. How many little kids pick up a toy gun and shoot daddy, and daddy goes, ah, and he pretends to fall down, and the little kid jumps around, squealing and dancing. Yeah. If you really took a look at that, so, there are these ancient, archaic themes that are being dramatized in play, in children's play.
And the shadow, our human primal shadow, is lifted up in fairy tales. The realities are not disguised. They're not, glossed over in any way. So this fairy tale deals with envy, of a mother's envy of her child. That first she wants this beautiful baby with this splendid coloring that will gratify mom. If I have a really beautiful baby, she will enhance me. She will be a narcissistic extension of me and make me look good until, the darn kid is starting to outshine me. I don't like that. Well, obviously the only thing to do is to plot her demise and to outsource it. So that, that's the original intention is, I'll just get myself a hired gun or a hired huntsman in this case. And then, as you say, the cannibalism, but I want to eat her lungs and her heart.
And her liver.
Her liver, which was the source of life in ancient times. It was considered to be. What do you think about the lungs?
I'm not sure, but I do have a sense that by devouring some part of Snow White, that she is then ingesting this beauty that is greater than her, and it will then become part of her.
And you take on the characteristics. And we do this all the time, that, we are going to, by ingesting something, by ingesting a lion or part of a lion or a
the
bear's
Eucharist.
Liver or, oh my goodness.
You eat the body of Christ and drink his blood, and then some aspect of Christ is then in you. You've metabolized the mythopoetic figure.
So it's become very symbolic, thank goodness, and appropriately. But that's a real development in the human psyche over eons versus the concretization of, if I eat the heart of a lion, I will become lion-like. I will take on the characteristics of that animal. And Snow White's mom will take on Snow White's beauty. She'll be reinvigorated. She'll be regenerated.
So that's a fantasy. But there are really, it's a very small cast of characters.
It's a fantasy? Oh, darn. Okay.
Because whatever lives in the mirror is the truth teller.
Mm-hmm.
It is, to me, it's the self that no matter how distorted or evil or narcissistically enraged the queen becomes, there is some spirit in this fairy tale that is not intimidated by her, is not provoked, but just keeps speaking the truth, just tells the truth.
But we've just bumped into one of the major symbols. A mirror, you could write probably 100 Jungian theses on the topic of the mirror. It's so big. And that at first, the reflection that the mirror provides gratifies the queen. The truth is you're the fairest of all. But the source, a mirror has to have light in order to function. If you have a mirror and you're in a dark room, forget about it.
That's right.
And it does, as you say, sort of reveals the essential nature of something. If we look in the mirror and, we see something that we don't like or that we do like, and we approve of it as we, fix our hair, maybe put on makeup, all of these things. And then, I'm just thinking about all of the possibilities for a mirror to reflect. And what happens when it reflects something that we don't like?
Much like analysis.
Oh, uh-oh. Say a word or two about that, because that's right on.
I mean, there are times that we as analysts decide, hopefully timed well, to
hopefully
interpret and reflect back to one of our analysands information that their ego is not going to find appealing, is going to be upsetting, or going to lift up something that is painful for them.
Right. Or there could be a dream and the person says, oh, I know exactly, what this dream means. It ended happily ever after and everything. And it's the job of the analyst to say, well, no, let's look at that from another angle. Perhaps the image of, let's say, a deer in your dream, could also mean this, because all these images usually have a sort of a bright side and a darker side. And we all want to look on the bright side, which takes me to mirroring of children developmentally. And how important that is when a child is young. That this 3-year-old comes up to us all bouncing with delight and says, look, do you know what I can do? And we all say, no, you know what? And child says, I know how to do a somersault. Do you want to see me? And most everybody will say, wow, that's amazing. Oh, yes, of course, I have to see that to believe it. And so what happens with mirrors, and I'm thinking about those wavy mirrors at circuses.
That distort people, yeah.
Yeah, that distort us. Of what is reflected has many facets.
It does indeed, and is unpredictable. But I think the spirit of the mirror is, it just tells the truth. I mean, many of us get a photograph taken for your LinkedIn profile or any number of things. It is very difficult to not be critical of ourselves. I didn't know my nose was that big, or whatever it is. Although we might tell ourselves that facts are friendly, whenever what we are shown is dystonic or doesn't match up with our inner representation, there's some creative tension that builds up inside of us. So there's several ways we could interpret fairy tales. One is we could interpret as if it is a dream happening within a single person's psychology. In which case, then, we could think of each of the characters as aspects of a human psyche. I find that to be kind of gratifying because we can kind of personalize it. So, from the standpoint of Snow White, we have a really young and innocent, lovely in a way, feminine psyche. And she's going about her life in a very usual way. Being a daughter, we can imagine she's a princess. She's unself-conscious about her appearance, as children are. And if we imagine that inside of us, when we are young, well, inside of all of us, whether or not we're young, we can have a very innocent and young part of ourselves that's kind of playing, moving around inside of us. If the very, very innocent part of us remains there too long, let's say into our 20s, maybe our 30s, maybe even later in life, there's a way in which being an innocent, childlike person can activate other forces in the psyche to change that situation. That remaining innocent and young forever is a problem.
You know, I think often about a number of fairy tales in which the message of the tale, when there is a female protagonist, Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, Rapunzel, Sleeping Beauty, that the theme of those fairy tales is something about the innocence complex of snap out of it. Or Hansel and Gretel, like God, they're just kids. And we see in this tale that Snow White's just a kid. She's 7 years old. You know, I had remembered or thought that she was a teenager by now, but no, she's 7 when she sparks her mother's envy. And that fairy tales are really blunt. It doesn't matter if you're just a kid. There will be a price to pay if you don't snap out of your innocence complex. Now, Gretel in Hansel and Gretel, they're innocently abandoned in the forest. They have no recourse. But Gretel gets it up to shove the old witch into the fire.
But she becomes the assistant of the witch. She becomes the sous chef.
Oh, that's
she becomes
hilarious.
her protege.
Yep.
That's the witch's fantasy.
And Cinderella, snaps awake enough to say, hey, you know what? I'll find something to wear, but I'm going to the ball. Sleeping Beauty falls asleep, who goes around the castle and has her fingers pricked by a spindle, which is pretty hard to do.
Right.
And Snow White is really innocent supreme. She doesn't get it that her mom has these hostile feelings toward her. And she doesn't get it when her mother comes around 3 times. And I know when I read these tales as a child, I was like, what is her problem? What a ninny. She still doesn't get it. And it also points to a theme similar to the theme of the vampire. You have to open the door. You have to let the evil in. Vampires can't cross the threshold or come through the window unless you open the door or open the window. And the envious mother could not work her evil magic if Snow White didn't open the door and say, oh yeah, that's great. I'd love to have that new lace. I'd love to have a special comb. What a nice apple.
So there's a way of thinking about it psychologically that when somebody is trapped in an innocence complex, it conjures the evil queen in other people as well as in ourselves. So if somebody is trundling around and seems overly innocent at the used car dealership. You might find that the salesman is like, yes, I'll sell you this car, but what about that $5,000 extended warranty? And what if and then we'll add this and we'll add that. And somebody in the innocence complex will be like, well, I just trust this guy. It's going to be just fine. But being overly innocent actually conjures this darkness in other people, which is tricky.
So there is something we need to be aware of: the con man, the dynamic, the envy, the manipulation. Wake up, snap out of it, because otherwise you're what they call a mark. It takes two. It takes both an innocent who can be duped and somebody who wants to take advantage, manipulate, or even destroy you. And if you're awake and alert and can recognize it, which is part of what fairy tales teach us, then you go, oh, no. Boy, I would never open the door to a sweet old lady offering me nice things. There's a warning and a lesson of, oh, maybe this is too good to be true.
So there's a feeling in the fairy tale that we just read that Snow White seems strangely unaffected by these brushes with death. It's like the witch tied this thread around you and you suffocated to death. And the dwarves rescue you and say, listen, this is what the world is like. You can't let strangers in. And then whatever amount of time passes, the witch comes back, the evil queen comes back, and she gives it another shot. And Snow White's like, yeah, I'll go along with the comb, no problem.
That we maybe want to believe that the good thing comes without a price. Of this nice old lady. Oh, yeah. Oh, you really want to give that to me? What we used to say as kids, free for nothing?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Of that we start to learn the world is transactional, and you're not that sweet baby anymore whose very being gratifies the caregiver and other adults. Babies are adorable. They are narcissistic extensions. But once you start to become a real child, a human being with wants, needs, personality, values of your own, you're not just unconditionally adored. And that's part of the lesson of, hey, look, Snow White, look, honey, you're 7 years old now. You're not that totally adorable. There's a give and take here in the world.
Right. Time passes in the dream somehow, but at the very least, in between each of the assassination attempts, we can imagine some amount of time passes so that by the time she's revived from the coffin, she's of marriageable age. But we hope.
Good point.
So we can forgive Snow White, so to speak, for the first mistake because she's young. She doesn't understand yet what's going on. Although she did have that encounter with the huntsman, and so she did know that murder was afoot.
Yeah.
So she's not totally innocent by the time she's helping out the 7 dwarves.
But there is sort of this regressive fallback into, I'll be good. And you know what? You guys can go off and I'll be the good little doobie, surrogate mommy, big sister, and I'll cook and I'll clean and everything will be nice in a different way, but life is still really nice, right?
Well, I think that dwarves kind of give her this, it's like a dollhouse, right? Tiny beds, tiny utensils, tiny
Yes,
place.
exactly.
I thought very much like a dollhouse for a tiny
Yeah.
girl, so to speak. It fits her perfectly when she arrives. She's small and everyone is small.
Yeah. That's the perfect analogy. She's playing house with her dollhouse, with these small men who are not big enough to be threatening. There's none of that sexuality stuff is in the air. And I kept thinking, the dwarves classically work under the earth. They work inside the mountain, and they extract from it the gems and gold and other treasure. Of that, they're the workmen from the underworld.
Sometimes they are connected with the Great Mother, inasmuch as they are privileged to go into the body of the Great Mother, which is the earth, and extract the goodness, and then bring that back into the world, into the community. And so they go in and they extract gold from the darkness. We don't know what they do with it, but we can imagine that they are kind of fabulously wealthy with this ability. And they have this certain kind of relationship to the Great Mother, are in a sense kind of servants of the Great Mother in her beneficent and providing aspect. And they are also very providing for her. They are motherly in a certain sense, that they're protective and they feed her and they want her to thrive.
So in a way, I'm thinking about, when I first started reading Jung, and I read this phrase, the treasure hard to attain. Oh my gosh, it just resonated with me. I must have been in my 20s way back then. I thought, I would so love, what is the treasure hard to attain? I would love to have the treasure. And it's the dwarves who find the treasure hard to attain inside the mountain, which of course is not gold or gems, but qualities of the self.
So we have a mother who is possessed by this kind of narcissistic darkness. That's one representation. Snow White herself is learning how to be motherly and providing for the dwarves. It's as if they are in some ways her children, cooking and cleaning and tending to them. And then there's the earth itself as the most archetypal mother that is providing resources and gold in some fashion. So mother energy in various different ways is kind of moving around in this process.
Yeah, all aspects of the mother archetype. And here it is, all part of one psyche, as you said earlier, that it's like a dream, but in a fairy tale, we as Jungians read the tale as one psyche, that there's an evil, homicidal, envious mother in all of us, and an innocent child, and a huntsman, and dwarves, and. And that's what sort of takes us aback of like, well, no, I mean, I'm not like that. Or am I?
Yes, which is part of why these stories survive, is that something inside of us understands the universality of this. Now, this is also a story about death and rebirth, because it isn't just that Snow White falls asleep like Sleeping Beauty. She dies. I mean, she dies 3 times in this story and is resurrected. And what we might hope, although the story is rather bare bones, but that each time that she comes back to life, something is added to her. And in the final rebirth, after the laborers accidentally dislodge the piece of apple.
Yeah, because they're sick of it.
They are. It's a wonderful, very realistic process. there isn't a lot of magic in the tale.
Yeah.
As people are telling the story, like, how would that apple get dislodged? Well, people just start tossing the corpse around, and all of a sudden it pops out of her throat. There's a very salty logic in all of that.
It attests to the value of just that human, God, am I tired of moving this thing around all the time? And the transgression of you would do that to this dead child, or by now maybe magically adolescent. You would go whack her on the back. And the transgression can be transformative in a positive way. And we see that in other fairy tales and that's the question, is when is transgression going to be transformative and when is it not?
Right. Because the prince has this attitude that she's to be venerated, almost like the body of saints that are entombed in cathedrals, and which you can, sometimes their bones are on display in a glass coffin as a relic. So there's a way in which the prince sees her as so beautiful, so awe-filled,
Right.
so unearthly that he's just going to take the glass case, like a museum glass case, and no one's going to touch her, and he's just going to, press his nose against the glass and behold her. But the more instinctive part of the psyche is really not interested. It wants to handle the artifact.
Yes.
Which is really interesting because it's through the contact, not keeping her as a precious relic, but they put hands on her and start moving her around.
Exactly. There's a lot of bodily physicality that brings things down to earth versus this idealization. This is a young woman who's dead. So the prince doesn't really have to deal with her in any kind of real way. He can just venerate her, worship her, adore her, without ever having to risk anything of himself, like they get into an argument or they're actually going to have sex. No, she's a precious object in a glass coffin.
It's very lofty, very unrealized.
Mm-hmm.
I also love that the servants are probably feeling what the reader is feeling. Like as I was reading the fairy tale, there is something kind of frustrating about this happening over and over again. Like, when is Snow White, going to learn something about the danger in the world? And so I feel like the servants who are frustrated start tossing her around. They're like, we're sick and tired of this.
Yeah.
The audience is a little sick and tired of like another iteration of this tragedy.
Right. Everything. And I picked up something when you were reading it in the tone of it, of that when things are so precious.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, she's so pretty. And the huntsman says, oh no, I can't possibly kill anybody as pretty as this. And then she goes and plays house with the dwarves and doesn't learn from the old lady that there is something that the tale evokes in all of us of like, enough already.
And the thread is so pretty, and the comb is so pretty, and the apple is so pretty.
Exactly. It's like, oh my God. And now she's in a coffin. It's like, we want the breakthrough of somebody getting down and dirty and saying, enough. Something real has to happen here.
Right. And I think the servants are the ones who, in their coarseness and what, like you said, transgressive disrespect, unwittingly, or perhaps guided by a power greater than themselves, actually dislodges the poison.
It's really great. It says the servants who had to carry the coffin from place to place in the castle all the time, imagine, became angry about this. And at one time, a servant opened the coffin, lifted little Snow White, our precious girl, into the air and said, Why must we be plagued with so much work because of a dead maiden? And then he shoved little Snow White's back with his hand, and out popped the nasty piece of apple. So something that is healthy and real, unlike the mother's envy, but the healthy, legitimate protest occurs.
It's like a repetition compulsion. It's like the servants are like again and again and again.
Yes.
And there's so many iterations that happen in the
Yeah.
story. It's like, how many times is she going to make a mistake and be dead and reborn? How many rooms do we have to drag this glass coffin around? That there's something tedious and frustrating for the servants, and perhaps in some part of us as well.
And it's so pure. It's just so pure that there she is in her glass coffin, and glass is, of course, it's a barrier, but it's transparent,
Mm-hmm.
and nothing ever changes, and everything is in stasis.
Right.
And as you said before, and she's so pretty. And something in the psyche really rebels and says, I'm done.
Yeah, it's like we've got to just break the glass. So this violation of innocence happens a number of times, and we could even see that the last piece where the frustrated servant, knocks her on the back, is one piece of that. So in a single psyche, we have a part of us that can be trapped in what we would call malignant innocence. Like, we get to a certain age, maybe even in middle life, where we just can't trundle around like a kid anymore, expecting people to take care of us or expecting the universe or the world to treat us sweetly because we're so sweet. So inside of the psyche is also another part of the feminine, which is the queen. So the princess has inside of herself the queen. That is implied. If one is a prince, somewhere inside there is a nascent king. If one is a princess, somewhere inside there is a nascent queen. And that there is a battle, between the ego, between the princess and the queen.
Mm-hmm.
And a problem, perhaps in this psyche, we're going to kind of soar up to a very meta-conscious level, is that the queenly part of the psyche is plagued by this innocence complex inside. Now, if we take away demonizing the queen for a moment, that there are times where any of us can be taken just one too many times. And maybe we've had some religious decision to be very understanding and very sweet and very kind. And if that's taken advantage of one time too much, then something else will activate on us, and it is the spirit of vengeance and rage and hatred, which is in service to life in a way.
Yes, exactly.
It's happened 3 times. I'm finally going to take this person to court, or I'm going to call the police, or whatever it is that's required, but we're going to go to war.
Right. Or just on the home front of, the child comes home from school, drops his or her jacket on the floor, and mom says, hang it up. And the kid goes running to the pantry or the fridge for, hey, go pick up your jacket, hang it up. After the 3rd time, it's like, mom's going to be mad. Darn it, I told you, pick up that jacket, put that down, march over there this minute, hang it up. That we are pierced by anger, by outrage, by, some kind of forces in the psyche of other people or parts of ourselves that say this is enough.
So sometimes we go after our own predisposition to be childlike or innocent. Like, I just cannot be taken advantage of one more time. I just can't. And so then something, we could say darker, but also something more worldly, something more ferocious can activate in us. And we don't lose our innocence just because we are frustrated with ourselves. There is a process that goes on. We might try to tie our innocence up so that it can't make decisions about the stock market for us.
And sometimes those lessons are really, really brutal. Your mention of the stock market really set something off in me. People that 25 years ago invested in the dot-com bubble. People that get done in by all kinds of quote smart unquote investments in crypto or 100 other things, and then are shocked into a rude awakening when, either they've been conned or the thing that was supposed to be wealth producing turns out to be a bust. And our own greed has been behind all of that.
That we overheard something, or we saw a bit of advice on Instagram or TikTok, or we read a little bit in a blog, and then all of a sudden the innocent part of us is like, well, that's enough. I'm going to throw a bunch of money over there because I'm sure that I've received some really important, exclusive information. And there is all too often a terrible result.
Where I'm moving to at the very end of the fairy tale is it's always interesting to me to see what the punishment is going to be. It's going to be something gory and grim and grisly, but which one of a number of, of gory punishments can there be? So this is one where she has iron slippers, so they're very heavy. You couldn't possibly dance in iron slippers. And you certainly couldn't dance in iron slippers that were going to be heated, except that you would jump around in a frenzy, somehow trying to alleviate the pain. But I'm going back to a trope that I think we've mentioned, I don't know how many times on the podcast, of something about the standpoint is altered. Of that part of the psyche represented by the queen is in pain. This is the wrong standpoint. It's an impossible standpoint. I think we've talked about the shoemaker and the elves, and they craft little slippers. They're the 12 dancing princesses who wear their slippers out every night. So whenever I think about shoes, I think about standpoint, and that we automatically intuit it whenever we see people just on the street of who's wearing what, of like, oh my God, there's somebody wearing gladiator sandals. We notice. We notice platform shoes. We notice stilettos. The list goes on and on. And we notice brands. These are very, very cool brands of running shoes. So this is what that part of the psyche gets at the end, is it's too hot to handle.
I think that's right on. I also am curious about why she goes. The princess has found her mate. There's going to be a wedding. She's going to be the queen of her own queendom. The old queen's got her old stuff over there. What is she thinking is going to happen when she's planning to come to the wedding? Is she going to try to take Snow White down again? Is she going to spoil it in some way or show them up? Or
what does it say? The queen heard this, was horrified, and became so afraid, so very afraid, that she didn't know what to do. However, her jealousy drove her so much, she wanted to be seen at the wedding. And when she arrives, she sees that Snow White is the bride. So there she has to go. I have to see it for myself.
And that's the fatal flaw. If she could have just shut up and let Snow White alone.
Right.
She could have had an ongoing life, but she just couldn't stop. So she shows up. Snow White's there. Now, something interesting has probably been happening lo these many years, that there has been poison in her mouth. One might say that some of the poison of the evil queen has worked its way into Snow White's psyche. So by the time she wakes up for the third time, or is reborn the third time, and is mature enough to become a queen, that now she has enough access to her own inner queen, her own darkness, that when she faces off with her mother, she is every bit as ruthless and capable of protecting herself where she was not when she was 7.
Even though the tale doesn't say directly that Snow White was the agent of the heated iron shoes, it's like in a dream. When one thing follows another, causality is implied. So you're right on that now there it is in the field, Snow White's capacity to say,
Enough.
yeah, here are your just desserts. Deal with it.
Yes, and a realization that if she is merciful, it just will never end.
Right.
That the relentlessness of this figure is just inexhaustible. So this face-off, we have too much innocence, which conjures this shadow figure. The two things interact in many, many different ways, and in the end, Snow White has some access to her own shadow, her own capacity for violence and vengeance, and also finally just making order in her own psyche, like enough of this craziness. It just is not permitted any longer. And so finally, we have a resolution.
Yeah, finally. And I think most readers of Snow White, this is just my own hunch, or maybe it's just a downright projection, but I always thought Snow White was the ninniest ninny that ever there was, of what is wrong with you? And so the tale goes on and on and on. And I think the tale is making the point that we all want to deny, which is, and where is that in you, that you still don't get it? You still didn't get it. That this is the third time that kid promised to pay you for your baseball cards and didn't. But as readers, we can take that opposite position, which is to say, oh my God, she was just a total nitwit, and start to take in some of that of wake up. I know what's going to happen to you. It isn't going to be good. It's going to, that the old hag is going to do it again. And we absorb a little of that tough stuff so that the next time that kid comes along, we say, you still owe me 35 cents.
We have that set in our jaw and that determination that this nonsense isn't going to continue.
Yeah. I was swindled once. I was swindled out of 15 cents.
To get even?
No, I didn't get even. It was some kid that I didn't really know at school and promised me. And he was older, smarter about these ways of the world than I was. And when I asked him for it, he just sort of brushed me off and went away like, oh, come on. You didn't think I was really going to pay you back. I mean, come on. This was a swindle from the outset. And I've never forgotten it.
It's a marker for a moment where we learn something about human beings, human shadow, and inconsistency.
And I didn't know who the kid was. I don't know. I was in second grade and he was in fourth or something like that. Obviously much older. And the teacher sort of went, oh, that's too bad, but sort of shrugged it off. And I remember being so outraged that, crime had been committed and I needed defenders, justice justice should be the order of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I was shocked by this adult attitude of like, well, that's the stuff that happens out there on the playground.
Yes, you became wise at that young age. This is how it works around here.
Yeah, this is the way this. So we have to descend into the reality of this earth and this society and these people.
Yes, our inner Snow White has to change. We've got to figure out what to do with our inner evil queens. There are allies along the way, some purposeful, like the kind 7 dwarves, and sometimes fate is our ally through the rough handling of Snow White's body.
Yeah. And in a sense, the mercy of the huntsman, who in some versions feels so sorry and he certainly can't do it. But in this original tale, he just says, good luck. I won't kill you, but I'm not helping you either. You're on your own, cookie.
As it is in the world, that we may fantasize someone's going to save us, but the truth is nobody can save you from yourself.
Yeah. We are all set forth to find our way in the wilderness of our own psyches, the world itself, and the wilderness. And good luck with that.
Absolutely. It is the initiatic task of adulthood.
Exactly.
Painful as it is for all of us, by the way. We all come in innocently into all kinds of circumstances and then have our scars to manage as a result of that.
This week, in addition to thanking you as ever for supporting us, supporting what we do, and making it all possible, we are going to answer and address some of the questions from a number of our listeners. So here goes. The first question comes from a listener who says,
I'm wondering if in Snow White, the poisoned apple, which Lisa has described as being held in Snow White's mouth and therefore transmuting the poison from the evil mother over time, I'm wondering if that transmuting of the poison over time is the poison of having a not good enough mother. And that only when Snow White's able to process over time not having a good enough mother or an evil mother in this case, then and only then do the little fractured parts of herself that are represented by the 7 dwarves can integrate and become one amicus image of the handsome prince. So that's my question. Thank you.
That's a really good question.
And shout out to Sianat for sending that in. That it's a question, but it's really a thesis that she is supporting.
Yeah.
And I love that hadn't occurred to me before. I just think it's brilliant.
Yeah, I agree. And yes, it is the poison of the terrible mother, the mother who is envious. And this is not a whole new human theme. There are women who have a very hard time as their daughters hit puberty, teenage beauty, young adulthood, become brides, become mothers themselves, where every mother has to reconcile that part of her own life is gone. That we see this beautiful young woman who goes to the high school prom and has a beautiful wedding, and then whose life is full and generative with the birth of a child that is envious.
Mm-hmm.
or envy of the child that has so many more opportunities than you ever did, who has a special talent, that all of us have a not good enough mother in some part. And some of us, of course, have had really difficult, wounding mothers.
So, quite so that as the poisonous experiences of this in the fairy tale, the dangerous mother, are metabolized, something is added to Snow White. I read an interesting study a few years ago that was talking about having an abusive mother figure and how that affects young girls differently from young boys, daughters and sons. That daughters have a tendency to be more resilient to an abusive mother because they can identify with the mother's power and assume that one day they too will hold such power. For the son, not believing that, he is in some ways more crushed and more despairing because he's experiencing the same suffering, but does not have a future where he imagines that he will have that same power and be the equal of the one who is being abusive. So there is a truth that the not good enough mother is a very tame experience by comparison than having, in the fairy tale, a murderous mother or a mother that is actively seeking to injure the child. But either way, I think the daughter is internalizing the potency of the mother, whether it's expressed negatively or positively, and knows that it is her destiny to have a similar power.
Yeah. What do you think about the idea that the dwarves represent sort of fractured parts of the masculine that then coalesces with the animus image of the prince? It's a great idea. Disney gave each dwarf rather, a name as if, representing different things of
different traits.
Different traits.
Sleazy and sleepy and Doc and,
Yeah. So it's an interesting idea. And yet they're a collective. They all go out and they all go to the mine and they all do exactly the same thing.
Like a flock.
Yes, exactly. It's a flock.
My feeling is that it's an interesting thesis that do they then knit themselves together in the individual psyche and then come back as a single masculine figure? I could absolutely believe that.
Yeah.
And we might imagine, as they were suggesting, that the time when she is in the glass coffin and she's learning how to metabolize the poison, that various things are melting down and recoagulating in her psyche, solveat coagula. And that could be these fragments of masculine image. Also, in the fairy tale, there are no fathers present at all. But we could imagine the dwarves as also being part of the father complex inside of her. That is, hardworking, providing, abiding, not terribly protective beyond advice, but it is when she is in nature, she has to run off into the forest and find the dwarves, that then she is exposed to a kind of kind and benevolent masculine that is caretaking her in some measure.
And it's also diffuse.
Yes.
Oftentimes people will dream about, I saw a crowd of people, or I was in an auditorium. That there's something there represented kind of as a collective that needs to become better personified, which does happen in the tale. That after the dwarves, we get a single person who is an adult, who's human, who's a prince, versus these benevolent dwarves that are both childlike and innocent themselves, and images of the masculine, the caretaking, kindly. aspect of the father. But, we should do a podcast sometime on the absent fathers. Where were all these fairy tale fathers? What were they doing?
Exactly. The other thing about the dwarves is that they're servants of the Great Mother. So the dwarves, the queen, the cottage, Snow White, they're all still in the world of the mother in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And it's finally with the appearance of the prince that there is a masculine that is independent of the mother.
Okay.
So that's an interesting and I think effective evolution. Is it possible that the dwarves themselves coalesce, separate out from serving the earth, Rhea, so to speak? It's an interesting fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sensibility to it, and I like the imagination in the question.
Do you want to move on to another question?
Sure. Bo, thank you for submitting this question.
Hi, Joseph, Lisa, and Deb. My question about Snow White, and I've only seen the original animated Disney version of it, but my question pertains to that final scene, that image of Prince Charming coming and saving Snow White with true love's kiss. Obviously, that's a huge trope now, and there's a ton of pushback to that. I think because, in modern times, we see the depiction of feminine passivity as kind of offensive, or, I don't know, we just cringe our nose at it, doesn't feel right. But my question is, isn't there more to that image than just, this helpless, lifeless woman needs a man to come bring her back to life? Because I think in myths sometimes, and I think it's true in life too, but, some things just happen regardless of our intent and our will, whether or not they're deserved. Sometimes they're deserved, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're both. But yeah, what are some more, I guess, what else can we draw from that image of, true love's kiss, waking up Sleeping Beauty or Snow White in this case? Thank you.
Well, you'll know from having listened to the episode that there is no kissing that happens in the actual Grimm's fairy tale, that it is nowhere near as romantic as Disney enjoyed portraying it. So that does not seem to actually carry the magic on an archetypal level that one might suppose.
But it also makes me turn to considering that, what did you call it? The Disneyfication
Yes.
of the fairy tale and in the original. That what is a kiss? What does a kiss symbolize? It's not a hug. It's not the wedding, which will come a little later. That there is a kiss of mouth to mouth, something tender that symbolizes a kind of awakening, a kind of love that is not too erotic, not in Disney anyway, that it has to be a kiss. What other gesture could it be? And I agree with Bo. I mean, my first thought was, oh my God, these helpless ninnies like Sleeping Beauty and Snow White who can't do anything for themselves. Thank God some prince comes along and wakes them up, brings them back to life. But we have to remember that the prince and Snow White are like heads and tails of a coin. They're just different sides of the same human condition.
I think it's tempting to want to look at any mythic material, fairy tales or myths, and then use them and imagine it as a real life situation, and then to project upon it whatever the cultural conflict is. But fairy tales and myths yield more if we hold a symbolic attitude. Anytime we literalize this kind of material, we can make whatever we want of it. So this isn't a real life situation. This is a symbolic encounter that's happening either in the collective psyche in some mysterious way, or in the psyche of an individual. So, when a woman feels lifeless, and let's say that she's fallen into a terrible depression, in the dream world, it is not uncommon for the vital aspect of a woman's psyche to present itself as a fascinating male figure. And that's just a symbol. It's not a person. And it's not saying anything about what happens in the outer world, because unfortunately it doesn't tend to work that way in the outer world. But in the inner world, energy is moved around in the psyche through symbols. And as those symbols interact with the dream ego, they impart something, a kind of medicine to the dream ego. So let's just say one were to have a dream. Let's say a woman dreams she is so depressed that she can't do more than open her eyes, that she's lying lifeless in bed, and depression can get that bad, by the way. And then some fascinating male figure comes and gives her a kiss, and she is roused from that and finds herself with energy and desire and vitality. That's a gift from the unconscious. That life force has been shared with the ego. Unfortunately, it's not that easy in the outer world. If all it took was somebody giving you a kiss to fill you full of vitality, my goodness, wouldn't that be easy? But in the inner world, it's different.
Yeah. It's the action that sparks something. The vitalizing spark, to borrow the title of one of Lisa's books, The Vital Spark. It could be a kiss. It can be a thunderbolt. It can be a touch with all the little Disney sparkles of the fairy godmother's magic wand. But it is the vital spark. And haven't we all had that happen to us? Of like, all of a sudden something happens, then we've been puzzling it over for months maybe, and then all of a sudden it's like, ping! Oh, now I get it. So if, and I think it's right on, the idea that a Snow White lying in her coffin is a slow, unconscious process of metabolization. Then when the moment is right, whatever the it is, whatever shape it takes, it ignites. In Sleeping Beauty, we wait 100 years. How come? All kinds of princes try to get in there and they get caught up in the wall of thorns. And then all of a sudden it happens. And that goes to Jung's idea about the unconscious has direction and is autonomous. So Snow White, ninny that she was, is also having an unconscious process. Something is alive in her, even though she looks like she's just supine in her glass coffin. But I put this fairy tale in the context of all the fairy tales where the protagonist is a female. So we have some very active, proactive fairy tale heroines, because I think this listener is seeing the passivity and the, oh, woe is me, I can't do anything for myself, I need to be rescued. But then Cinderella is pretty gutsy. Off she goes to the ball.
She's very gutsy.
Rapunzel falls for the prince who climbs up into her tower. Beauty claims the beast and goes back to him. I think Gretel was a really...
she was a badass.
She was a really great kid. You're not going to do that. I'm going to throw you into the oven. So I think these fairy tales are portraying all kinds of possible situations and actions or non-actions. But in this case, it's about the power of the unconscious to help us to have its own revival. That not everything is done with our egos. Exactly.
Let's take another one. Cindy writes in and says, I would like to hear about the symbol of the mirror in the story. We did address that in the episode.
But here's something else that I can offer to add to that. Jung, according to Jung, there are 5 instincts in us as humans. And 3 of them are sort of physical, of That there's sex, there is hunger and thirst. There's our need for activity. And one of them is self-reflection, the capability for self-reflection, that we reflect on things like, oh my God, I can't believe I said that in the middle of the meeting. Or, why did I have a second helping of the pasta, delicious as it was? So we can go back and mirror ourselves, look at ourselves in the mirror of our capacity for reflection and see something. And in the story, the only thing, the mirror tells the truth, but it doesn't provide the kind of self-reflection that the evil queen really needs. It just says, "Oh yes, you're really very beautiful. You're top dog here in your beauty." It doesn't do what the queen really needs, which is to say, "What is wrong with you?" Yeah, this is your kid. Get over it. Snap out of it. Wait. The queen too needs to wake up into a reality that her daughter is beautiful, is going to be coming into womanhood. So it's interesting that this mirror can only do one kind of very concrete, literal reflection, which is, yep, you're drop dead gorgeous, all right. I'm going to move on to a query from Connie, who says, so looking forward to this. Well, I hope we have fulfilled your hope. Such a weird collection of archetypes. I guess I have a split question. One, why does this theme of the heroine being, quote, dead and ready for rescue by the random young man keep showing up in these stories? I think of Sleeping Beauty here, which we've mentioned. Is this a trope only for our age? Or is this the young feminine needing to be rescued actually an ongoing, authentic thing in the world of archaic archetypes? And then 7 dwarves. Are they men or children symbolically? Maybe a kind of between masculinity while Snow White tries to individuate, getting ready for trusting the mature male archetype so she can deal with the shadow of female malevolent authority. She keeps trusting the wrong strangers and pays for it. And the men, children, the dwarves, in other words, rescue them, then watch over her. The tending to self is in the more innocent male energy. I can sort of see a Persephone theme going on, but also not. This is a wonderful series of more than 2 questions. So I think we've addressed the idea of the heroine being, quote, dead, unquote, as the autonomy of the unconscious. And I would say maybe the young feminine being awakened by animus, by the inner opposite that is conveniently portrayed as a prince. Opposite in a lot of ways. More worldly, has more agency, a whole host of other things that the feminine needs. And then I like this part that I don't think we've dealt with a lot. Yes, the dwarves are the precursor to the more mature masculine in the form of the prince. And that she can then deal with the shadow female malevolent energy. It's an interesting theme about the Persephone energy, that she does come up out of the underworld of this sort of soporific state into more of her own aliveness, that the mother archetype has put her into. But unlike Persephone, Persephone's mother, Demeter, went after her with everything she had.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you're not doing that to my daughter. And I will do whatever I have to do, including scorching the earth, to get you back. versus the evil mother who says, I'm going to put you away.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to the underworld of the dead.
I'll take up a little different bit of the question.
Okay.
Why does this theme of the heroine being dead and ready for rescue by the random young man keep showing up in these stories? And what I would say is they don't keep showing up in these stories. That if you were to read Grimm's fairy tales from cover to cover, there are talking frogs and there are all kinds of things that happen.
Yeah, and that heroine in that fairy tale had a lot of moxie. She takes that frogs and goes whammo, throws them against the wall.
Right. So whatever these stories are, I think you're not talking about fairy tales, which are very varied. You're asking a question is that why does, let's say Western culture, why does Western culture seek to venerate romantic stories?
Yeah.
It's about the kind of romantic fantasy that girl and boy meet and magic happens. And that has more to do with the zeitgeist of a culture, that the culture pays for those stories. They will show up at the theater. They'll pay for them. They'll talk about them. They want to see them several times. They'll shed a few tears. That what is propagated in the culture is based purely on commerce. And if somebody were to make a movie of all of the Grimm's fairy tales, the ones that people won't see don't show up in the zeitgeist. So the bigger question is, why does the culture want to keep propagating romantic stories? And as you would have heard from our episode, is that the Snow White story doesn't involve being rescued by the prince. It's much more complicated and not romantic at all. So I think, again, it has to do with Western culture and the fantasies of romance. That's commerce.
And it's also the archetype of the romantic ideal.
Yes.
Of, oh my goodness, it's as old as time, of that we all long for an other out there in the flesh that we connect with, and then everything ends happily ever after. Romance is just part of the human condition.
It is, and pair bonding is part of human history. People fall in love, they come together, they build homes, they have children. And maybe one day that will change. But
they get divorces.
They get divorces.
I also see it as a valuing of female agency, which has been pretty well denied. There's a history of that, and that there's a wish here in this questioner, listener, of where is your own energy, your own agency, and of course it's there.
And fairy tales talk about the discovery of agency all the time in all kinds of permutations.
Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.